Tell you a couple things before we do this, so that it's on the recording. If you look on SLCC Anatomy, there are 2 more tutoring days in the STEM Center. It's like 2 4-hour blocks with tutors, and the tutor is also a lab aide. So if you want to take advantage of that. In addition, you probably already heard this, but I'm going to reiterate that this whole week from Wednesday to Wednesday is review, right? And then next Wednesday, in lab, they've already had one Wednesday review, so we're going to open up next Wednesday. All of the scheduled classes are open labs all day long. Does that make sense to you guys? Okay. So if there is a scheduled class at any time, you can look up the schedule just as well as I can. It's on SLCC Anatomy too. You are welcome to come to any scheduled lab on Wednesday next week for open lab all day. You just have to look at the door, because if the instructor is giving a quiz, he's going to keep everybody else out until the quiz is over, and then you can come in for open lab. Good? So that's in addition to the review week that is already going on, and the regular open labs that are already there. Good? Okay. Seems like there's something I'm forgetting to tell you, but I don't know what it is. Okay. So let's finish up the muscle and talk about just, all we're going to do is really quickly compare and contrast cardiac muscle tissue to skeletal muscle, and then smooth muscle to skeletal muscle. We didn't go into a ton of detail about these like we did with skeletal muscle. And then we're going to get into skin today. Okay, so cardiac muscle tissue, you guys already know where it occurs. It is, of course, the main component of the heart wall, right? It is striated similarly to skeletal muscle. It probably won't surprise you that because it is striated similar to skeletal muscle, it has a very similar arrangement of actin and myosin, which is how skeletal muscle got striated, right? So the same thing that you were seeing here, this would be an A band and then an I band and then an A band and then an I band, right? Because it's got myosin and actin just like skeletal muscle. It's not innervated or stimulated in the same way because, of course, cardiac muscle is involuntary. You can't control it voluntarily. And skeletal muscle is generally voluntarily controlled. So it's not started, the contraction isn't started the same way, but the mechanism, once you get it started, is pretty similar. And you talk about that in a lot of detail in phys if you guys are going to take phys. So it's striated, it's involuntary, it's got some similarities to skeletal muscle. Let me reduce this one real quick. Remember that some of the differences are that if you look at cardiac muscle, the cells are shorter, so you often, not always, see the ends of a single cardiac muscle cell on a histology slide, but I've never seen both ends of a skeletal muscle fiber on a histology slide. I haven't ever, right? It just like cuts off because that's as much as you were looking at. And then remember, of course, that it's branched, right? Not all of them, but sometimes you can see branching. And you guys remember, do you remember what an intercalated disc is? It looks like a dark striation, but does anybody remember what's actually in there? Who remembers? It's got two types of intercellular junctions. Desmosomes for strength, and then what else? Gap junctions. So the reason it stains so dark is because we use this protein staining technique, and those are proteins, right? So it stains really dark at the, does that make sense? At the intercalated disc. Okay, so the other important thing that you'll talk about in a lot of detail when you get to phys is that with cardiac muscle, you don't need to innervate every individual cell like you do with skeletal muscle, right? Because they can talk to each other through the gap junctions. You guys remember that? And although it's not written here, I'll go ahead and tell you, because you're going to talk about it at some point, that you actually don't even have to tell cardiac muscle to contract at all with the nervous system. Cardiac muscle will spontaneously generate contraction. So for instance, I could yank all of the nerves off of the heart and it would still spontaneously contract. Does that make sense? So it doesn't need nervous system innervation in order to contract. So what does the nervous system do to the heart? It just controls the rate. So the metaphor that I use for it is the heart has its own starter, right? But you have a gas pedal and brakes with the nervous system. That's what you have. But the gas pedal and the brakes don't do a damn thing if you haven't started it, right? Okay, so it has to basically initiate its own contraction, and then the nervous system can change the rate. So you talk about that mechanism in phys as well. Okay, now with smooth muscle tissue, where do you find smooth muscle? Smooth muscle is, of course, found in the wall of any hollow organ that's not the heart, yeah, and almost every tube that you have. Except capillaries. Capillaries are just simple squamous epithelium, but almost every other tube that you have in the body has smooth muscle in the wall. And primarily what it does is moves things through the tube or changes the lumen diameter of the tube. So we'll talk about peristalsis in just a second. But let's talk about some similarities and differences with smooth muscle. First, of course, the cells are the smallest of the three, and they're eyeball shaped, right? Okay. They're uninucleated, just like cardiac muscle cells are. And they're not striated, which would make you think, well, perhaps they have a different contraction mechanism. But it's not entirely different. It's just that the nature of striations in skeletal muscle was really because all of the myosin lined up with all of the other myosin, right? And so it made a dark stripe. Does that make sense? And then no myosin. Well, here, please note that you have a thick filament that is myosin, yeah? And you have a thin filament that's actin, but they're not lined up, right? And since they're not lined up, you don't get any striations, even though that whole sliding filament is the same mechanism of contraction. It also means that since they're going all different directions, when this smooth muscle cell contracts, it doesn't just pull in length, it wads up to the middle, which makes it really useful for the wall of a hollow organ like the stomach, because what it does is it kind of squishes the wall and not just shortens the wall when it contracts. So that's how smooth muscle is kind of similar and different from the other muscle tissues. So it contains actin and myosin, but there's no true sarcomeres. They look similar, but not the same as a sarcomere. And so there's no striations. And then you guys remember peristalsis, right? Peristalsis is that sort of coordinated contraction. That's how you get things to move through tubes. So let me show you a figure from a different textbook. I may have shown you this one before. I don't remember. So when you are looking at smooth muscle and you look at the wall of any tube, and this just happens to be the small intestine, but it could be a different tube. So what quite often you have to get things to move through tubes is you have at least 2 layers of smooth muscle that's oriented differently. This one is wrapped in a circle. So if this is my small intestine, I've got 1 layer of smooth muscle that's wrapped around this way. And when you contract those cells, what does it do to the lumen diameter? It decreases it, right? Okay, so you squish the stuff in the tube, right? And then you've got another layer on the outside that's longitudinally arranged. And when you squish that one, it pulls the stuff through the tube, right? So when you alternate those two, you squish it and then pull it, especially if this is the mouth and this is the anus, right? Okay, I realize the small intestine does not connect the mouth and the anus, but you know what the hell I'm talking about, right? What happens is if you squish it and then pull it from that side, right? Squish it and then pull it from that side, then you move things slowly through the tube via peristalsis. Does that make sense? So you squish, pull, squish, pull, squish, pull. Okay, so that's really easy to see if you look at a snake eat, because you can kind of see it squish, pull all the way down. You basically have the same intestines, you're just not long and skinny like a snake, so you can't see it moving through. Now, if you were moving solids, a lot of times you'll need an extra layer of, especially if you're moving solids like a big organ like the stomach, you'll have an extra layer in addition to those 2. So the stomach has 3 layers of smooth muscle because it's moving big stuff. If you're moving liquids and the stuff in the small intestine is mostly liquid, then it's usually thinner layers and you don't need as many. So basically, as you're moving stuff through your intestine, it's solid in the esophagus, right? So it's only got 2 layers, but they're thick. It's solid in the stomach. It's got 3 layers, and they're all thick. And it's liquid in the small intestine, and then it's solid again in the large intestine because it compacts the stuff and sucks all the water out of it, and that's how you make poop, all right? So you see the thickness changes as you move from solids to liquids as you go through. Okay, so that's called peristalsis or peristaltic contraction, and that's the end of muscles. So now we are ready to do skin. Skin sounds like it would be boring, but it's actually not. It's pretty interesting. And the reason I cover it out of order is just so that you guys can have my help with muscles and bones, because I think you need my help a little more with those than you do with skin. Okay, so you guys already did skin a long time ago in lab. We do it in quite a bit more detail in lecture than you guys do in lab, but we do some of the similar slides and stuff. All right, so let's start on these. All right, so you can look at the skin in two different ways. You can look at it as an organ, or you can look at it as an organ system. So the reason that skin, you can look at it as an organ, is because it's made of at least 2 layers of tissue, right? And that makes it an organ. So I know that you know this, but tell me anyway. What are the tissues that make up the skin from superficial to deep? Keratinized, stratified squamous epithelium, and then connective tissue, be more specific. Dense, irregular, and areolar, right? Connective tissue, some little mix of those depending on whether you're in the reticular layer or the papillary layer. So because it is actually at least 2 tissues functioning together, it can be considered an organ. As an organ, you either call it the skin, but in anatomy, you know you need a fancier word. You can also call it the integument or the cutaneous membrane, right? That's what you call it. It's actually the largest organ in your body. The only one that's even close to the size is the liver. Have you seen how big the damn liver is? Pretty freaking impressive, that beast. So, but the skin is the largest organ in the body. It weighs between 6 and 9 pounds, depending on how big you are, and not how fat you are, because we are not talking about the subcutaneous layer or the hypodermis yet. That's actually not part of the skin. It's always taught with the skin, but it's not part of the skin. So between 6 and 9 pounds of just skin. If you're a really tall or really big person, you're gonna have more skin. So that last 10 pounds you've been trying to lose, you just leave it. It's skin. No, I'm just kidding. You need it. You know you need it. You feel good about yourself. You're amazing. If you stretched it out, it covers around 2 square meters of surface area, depending on your body size. And it varies pretty dramatically in thickness. It varies between 1.5 millimeters and 4 millimeters. Any idea where your skin is thinnest? Thinnest. Any idea? Yeah, Alice, you're right. Eyelids, right? It's thinnest right here. If that doesn't make sense to you, where do you get wrinkles first? Right there. That's where you get them, okay? It's also pretty thin on your lips and around your lips, right? And where is it thickest? Hands, feet. Yeah, those 2 locations, especially if you have not exfoliated properly and you got hooves going on down there, right? I never had to worry about that until I got to Utah. And then all of a sudden I'm like, what the hell is happening down there? I need a freaking sander. So you gotta take care of that. You're gonna rip your sheets. But that's just like a function of A, getting older, and B, living in this desert climate. Okay, so the skin, the cutaneous membrane, is composed of 2 layers, the epidermis and the dermis, right? And when you just told me what tissues those are made of. Note to self, the subcutaneous layer or the hypodermis is not part of the skin. That will be a test question or a quiz question, and you'll probably miss it, so don't miss it, right? You're gonna stick it in there every time. Why do they teach it with the skin? Well, where else would you teach it, right? It's not considered part of the skin, and it varies really dramatically, and it varies really dramatically with hormones, estrogen, testosterone, and with age, and with, of course, body fat percentage that you have. Okay, so that is the skin as an organ, but why is the skin also considered an organ system? Well, because in addition to the epidermis, made of keratinized stratified squamous epithelium, and the dermis, which is all the way down until you start getting a lot of fat tissue, which is made of the 2 connective tissues that you guys told me. There are also all of these accessory structures, and because of all of those, you can consider it an organ system, because it's got sweat glands, it's got oil glands, hair follicles, and erector pili muscles, and all of that. Notice that the vast majority of that stuff is actually in the dermis. Most of it, even if it runs through the epidermis, it doesn't start there, right? Okay, so for me in lecture, I don't really test very much on these accessory structures, not because they're not interesting or important, but just because something has to go in anatomy in order to get through the material. So I don't really test on those. I test mostly on the dermis and the epidermis itself. Okay, but one question for you. Do you remember what's what? sebaceous and sudoriferous. Which one's which? What's sebaceous? Oil. And sudoriferous is sweat. Yeah? And then one last question. Those two glands, are they endocrine or exocrine? Yeah, those are exocrine glands, right? And then you had to know a little bit more detail about those for lab, but I don't usually test on that in lecture specifically. Okay, because we get into other stuff in lectures. Okay, so let's start to get an appreciation for what our skin does for us, because a lot of us spend a decent amount of time thinking about the appearance of our skin, but not the function of our skin. And so what does your skin do for you? In order to get a good appreciation for that, I want you to think for just a second about the ways in which a person's health is at risk if, for instance, they have third-degree burns over 75% of their body. In what ways are their health at risk? Is their health at risk?
They have open wounds, so they're open to infection.
Infection, absolutely. What else?
They don't have a lot of protection from the sun.
Yeah, they have no UV protection. How about thermoregulation? Can they regulate? Okay, what else? Dehydration is a big one too. So all of these, and then there are more. So intact skin is really a good physical barrier, right? It's a good protection, especially when you acknowledge the fact that in addition to just being a coating, it's also keratinized on the surface, right? So the keratin itself helps to control what you lose, but it also helps to control what gets in, right? So let's start talking about the functionality of the skin and getting some appreciation for it. So it is, of course, protection from microbial invasion. It's protection from any kind of pathogen, viruses and bacteria and fungi. So unbroken skin is a good physical barrier. And just think about whether, if you get a skin infection, is it likely to occur in a place that didn't already have damage? Or in all likelihood, is it a place that got damaged somehow? Right. Even if it was just a zit before, right? It was open, right? So generally speaking, you're going to have to sort of damage the protective barrier before the pathogens that can get in. Now, there are exceptions because there are flesh-eating bacteria, but thank heavens they are not more ubiquitous than they are, right? Most of the time it actually is damaged and then you get an infection. In addition, your skin also has some capacity to sort of actively protect itself. It has secretions that are inhospitable to bacteria and they're slightly acidic. So it'll make you look weird if you do it right now. But if you ever licked your skin, it's slightly tangy and tart, okay? And that's because acids are tangy and tart. And what happens is your skin secretes a slightly acidic secretion that is unfriendly to bacteria. And it helps to control the things that actually are sort of living on your skin. Your skin also contains some immune cells. We might get to them today, or it might be on Monday that we do. But your skin has some immune cells that hopefully help keep pathogens that happen to make it into your skin from going very deep. So those are white blood cells called Langerhans cells, and they help to destroy pathogens and cancers. And then, as you mentioned, as Faz mentioned, your skin protects you from dehydration because of all of that keratin. Yeah. And so you don't lose water very readily, and water-soluble substances don't get in very readily. So for instance, you don't absorb every single thing that touches your skin that's water-soluble because of that keratin. And by the way, keratin is not really waterproof, but what it is water-resistant, right? It provides a barrier. And then although it seems kind of silly, your skin actually protects you from mechanical damage. Because if you think about it, when you run into stuff, like you run into the coffee table, right, and you scrape your knee on the coffee table, what you're actually running into the coffee table with are dead cells, aren't they? So you're actually protecting the living cells with the dead ones that are on the surface. And so you don't do as much damage to living tissue as you would imagine because you're actually running into it with dead tissue. And then your skin, we will get into this today, your skin is tremendously protected from UV damage. And one of the reasons that that's really important is that UV radiation is a known mutagen, meaning it causes mutations in your DNA. And anytime you have a mutagen, it increases the likelihood of cancer, which is a carcinogen. So UV radiation is a known mutagen and carcinogen, and our skin protects us from most of it if we let it. Okay, your skin also does some excretion and secretion. So we already talked about some of the secretions, which are those acids. What is the difference? We talked about this once before between excretion and secretion. Yeah, excretion is waste products. And we don't think about this very often, but your skin actually gets rid of some of the waste products. You may have encountered this. Have you ever been to an old folks home? And a lot of times they're taking tons and tons of medication. What does their skin smell like? It smells like medicine because they are actually breaking it down in addition to the liver and their kidneys, right? They're breaking it down and excreting it onto the surface of their skin. Sometimes you can smell specifically what medications people are taking because you get so used to smelling it. But if that doesn't make sense to you, this metaphor works way better in Texas than it does here. But if you go in a tequila bender and you drink 6 shots of tequila, you wake up the next day, what does your skin smell like? Regret and tequila is what it smells like because you are excreting those waste products onto the surface of your skin. It's the last thing that you want to smell the next day. It's going to follow you all damn day and go, poor decision-making skills, Melanie, poor decision-making skills. Get it together. When are you going to be the grown-up? No, I'm just kidding. I don't drink tequila. I was raised in Texas. I got that over by the time I was 14. Honestly, I didn't even know kids didn't drink here. They're like, you don't drink in high school? I'm like, what the hell do you do? No drinking? No what? But maybe it's a better place to raise my son. I don't know. Okay, so that's excretion and secretion, and now body temperature regulation. There are 2 ways in which your skin can do body temperature regulation. The first is just intact skin is like closing all the doors on your house, right? If you close all the doors on your house, you're more likely to keep the temperature in, right? And allow it to be different from external temperature. So that's just sort of this passive insulation way. But then there's also more active ways, which is vasoconstriction and vasodilation. So you can change blood flow to your skin to cool and warm your body. So if, for instance, you are really, really cold, yes, what you can do is vasoconstrict the blood vessels that go to your skin. What you're really trying to do is to keep the warm blood at your core, right? Because you're in a blizzard. And if you had to lose something via frostbite, would you rather lose a finger or a liver? Yeah, you'd rather lose a finger because you got extras, right? So you keep the warm blood at your core. That's also the reason why if that proceeds for a really long time, you're going to end up losing digits, nose, things like that, toes to frostbite because you're not sending any warm blood to those places. So that's vasoconstriction. Vasoconstriction also, of course, will make your skin slightly pale, right? And then if it's pretty dramatic, it can make your lips a little blue, right? Because there's not very much oxygen going, or the nail beds kind of blue. Do you guys ever see that? My hands are usually cold, so my nails are kind of usually blue. So that's vasoconstriction. And vasoconstriction can cause that blue skin look, which is cyanosis. Cyanosis is not always because of vasoconstriction. Sometimes it's because you're having a heart attack or your respiratory system is failing, but it's just sort of a general term that means your skin is slightly blue because not good oxygen flow. Vasodilation also happens, and vasodilation happens for several reasons. One of them is thermoregulation. So if you get really hot, what happens to your skin? It gets red, right? It gets red because when I get really hot, what I'm going to do is I'm going to send this, I'm basically going to use it as a swamp cooler, right? What I'm going to do is I'm going to send this warm blood to the surface, right? Hopefully the air is cooler than my warm blood, and it goes to the surface, and then you run the cool air across it. It's like blowing on soup. So it cools it down, and then you circulate it back to the core to cool down your organs. Does that make sense? In addition, when it's up there, it usually activates sweat glands, which helps to cool you further, right? So that's how the vasodilation works. But vasodilation can also be triggered by emotion. It can be triggered like you can blush, right? So it could be for thermoregulation for other reasons. Everybody good with that? Okay, so your skin also does sensation because that's a great place to have sense organs, right? Your skin also does vitamin D synthesis. You may or may not know this, but most people do. UV radiation in limited quantities, you really only need a few minutes a day, will cause you to make and activate vitamin D. It actually has to be completed. The process has to be completed in your kidneys. But basically, you hit your skin with limited amounts of UV radiation of a certain wavelength, and then it allows you to make vitamin D. And vitamin D is necessary for calcium absorption. And calcium is, of course, necessary for your skeleton, but also for other things. But I don't know if you guys knew this. Over the last 5 years, they've done a decent amount of research on vitamin D and our population. Did you guys know that almost all of us are going to be vitamin D deficient in the middle of winter if we live in either of the valleys? If we live in Salt Lake Valley or Utah Valley, almost everyone in those two valleys over the course of the winter is vitamin D deficient because you got a double whammy. You've got winter time, so you have less UV radiation. And then what do we deal with? We deal with the inversion, right? We deal with the smog. And so we will be vitamin D deficient. That's really important for parents to know, yes? Because you, of course, would like to make sure that your kids are getting adequate nutrients in order to grow well. So it's something that you might want to talk to your pediatrician about. It's also important for those of us who have heart problems. I have a heart problem, and just because I had scarlet fever when I was a kid. And so I have to supplement vitamin D as soon as fall hits and all the way through. Because you need calcium for cardiac muscle contraction, and I can't afford to mess with that. So most of us are going to be vitamin D deficient. How do you know? Well, you can either go to the doctor and have it tested, which is what I do, or you could just supplement it. And guess what happens if you take the supplement and you don't need it as long as you don't take 5 of the supplement? You just pee it out. Yeah? It's just expensive pee. You pee out most of your multivitamins anyway, guys. It's just basically expensive Technicolor pee. But you can give yourself a little wiggle room there. Also, I would like to tell you that if you have inherently darker skin, you are going to have more of a predisposition to low vitamin D because the UV radiation is also not getting in very deeply. So if you have the triple whammy, which is someone of African descent with dark skin who's living in Utah in the winter, then you better be supplementing your vitamin D. So it's really, really low in those particular populations. Okay, your skin also acts as a blood reservoir, and this sounds kind of weird, but basically when you're just sitting right here like this, you have 5 liters of blood, but you don't really need it to be rushing to your skeletal muscles, for instance, right? So what's it doing? Most of it's just sort of slowly percolating through your skin. But then if you go start working out, what will happen is you will shunt it away from your skin to your skeletal muscles. So right now, it's holding a disproportionate amount of your blood. It's not just sitting there. It's just sort of slowly working its way through. But you can always shunt it away. So, and then your skin is also for temporary storage of stuff. So water, glucose, fats, and salts are stored in your skin to greater and lesser degrees. Every woman in here knows that the amount of water and the amount of salt that you store in your skin varies with hormones. Yes, pretty dramatically. Like you can have massive amounts of water retention during certain portions of your menstrual cycle. And it also varies with what you take in. Like if you eat a 1-pound bag of Doritos, tomorrow you are going to be the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man. Is what's going to happen. It's going to be like, oh, my pants shrank and I can't get my rings off. So if you do both of them at the same time, because that's when you want a 1-pound bag of Doritos, right? Then you're going to have to buy new pants. That's all that's going to happen, right? Or just wear the stretchy ones. Okay, so now we are going to get to the layers of the integument or the layers of the skin. And we're going to do the epidermis first. And believe it or not, there's a whole hell of a lot going on in the epidermis. And the epidermis is here, right? And it is primarily just keratinized stratified squamous epithelium, but it's got some stuff running through it and has a few kinds of cells that you haven't met yet. So we'll go into it in a little bit more detail. And so with the epidermis, what we are going to do is we are going to learn it the way that it is built. We are going to learn the layers of the epidermis from the deepest layer to the superficial layer, because the way the epidermis grows is these are the new cells, and as they get older, they move up, 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 die, sloughed off. Does that make sense? Okay, so that process is usually around 30 days. So you get a whole new epidermis every 30 days. Most of us do. It depends. It's age dependent. It's a little bit genetically variable. But you get a whole new epidermis every 30 days. So before we get into the specifics, I want to introduce you to the layers of the epidermis, and then we'll talk about the specifics about each layer. You ready? So Latin for layer is stratum. Plural is strata, right? The bottom layer right down here that is in contact with the basement membrane at the basal surface of the tissue is called the stratum basale. Good? Okay. The next layer up, can you kind of see that the cells, some of them start looking pointy in here? You see some of the cells that are kind of getting squashed and pointy? Like that one's a good one right there to look at. This is called the stratum spinosum, as in spiny, as in pointy cells. Okay. So the stratum spinosum is this layer up here. It's variable in thickness. Okay. And then we move up. This one is called the stratum granulosum because look how grainy the cells look. Good? Okay. This one is called the stratum lucidum. What does lucid mean? If somebody says you have a very lucid argument, it means it's very what? Clear. Yeah, it's very clear. Yes? So that's the stratum lucidum. It's not present in all skin, but I'll tell you where it is and isn't present. And then the top layer is the stratum corneum. Corn as in unicorn, as in horn. Because it's made of the same stuff as it's the keratinized layers. The cells are dead there. It's made of the same stuff as hair, nails, rhino horn. I have no idea what a unicorn horn is made of, but let's just pretend. A rhino horn, fish scales, amphibian scales, hair, talons, all those kinds of things are made of the same stuff. Okay, so we are going to build this from the bottom to the top. The most is going on in the bottom layer. The bottom layer is where we are actually going to start, which is the stratum basale right here. Okay, the stratum basale is really, really active in cell division. So it is where all of the new cells are originally going to come from. It's the deepest layer of the epidermis. It is attached to the dermis by a basement membrane. And it's composed primarily of a single row of cells that look columnar to me. They're not called columnar because the whole tissue is called squamous, right? But they look pretty columnar primarily. And down there, those are called basal cells or keratinocytes for what they will eventually do, which is eventually they're going to start to produce keratin. They don't yet when they're down there. Okay, basal cells or keratinocytes. And here's what these guys are going to do. What they are going to do is, in all of us, they're going to go through relatively rapid cell division, and they're going to go right through rapid cell division as a cohort. They're going to all basically be stuck to one another, primarily with desmosomes. So they're going to be made all together. Then they're going to move up, and then some of them are going to divide faster than others. And then as they move up, eventually they're going to start producing keratin. They have to still have their nucleus and organelles when they're doing protein synthesis. So they have to do that before everything dies, yes? Okay. Then eventually, after they've produced a bunch of keratin, all of the organelles are going to die, and then they're going to be clear. And then eventually they are going to be at the top, and they're just going to be bags filled with keratin, yeah? And then they're going to slough off. That whole process from bottom to top takes around 30 days. To slough off the top of the stuff at the top. So what happens as you age, and we talked about this before, is exfoliation is mechanical. So that doesn't really change as you age. This rate of exfoliation is pretty much constant. It's just like mechanical. But the rate of cell division will slow as you age. And so, of course, what happens to the thickness of your epidermis then? It thins. Have you guys ever taken care of really, really elderly people? If you are not careful with really, really elderly people, what can happen to their skin when you move them? You can just tear. It's amazing how quickly it happens and how little you actually have to manipulate them in order for that to occur. So their skin is really, really thin. In addition, we will see that their dermis also thins as they age, so they don't have as much protection in the dermis either. So that process is going to be sort of dependent on your rate of cell division, right? Okay, so as cells are pushed up, they will produce keratin. Now, let's talk about how that is different in some people than other people. So first off, most of us are going to slough that off every 30 days. And most of your skin that you slough off, which is about 18 pounds of skin in your lifetime, most of it's in your house, right? And it's dust. Part of what dust is made of is skin of the people you live with. So make sure you live with someone that doesn't gross you out, right? Because you're just going to snort up all of their skin cells. So about 18 pounds in your lifetime that's just like hanging out in your house. Now, what is dandruff and what does it have to do with this process? What dandruff has to do with this process is that people who have dandruff have a rate of keratinization and exfoliation that's about 2 to 3 times the normal rate. Does it have anything to do with their hygiene? No, it just has to do with their rate of keratinization and exfoliation. Can hygiene exacerbate it? Well, yeah, because if I am exfoliating very regularly, but I'm also showering really regularly, then it doesn't end up on my clothes as often, right? Does that make sense? But if I am, for instance, indigent, homeless person, and I can't shower very regularly, then what's going to happen is you're going to see it, especially if I'm wearing dark clothes or have dark hair, right? But dandruff itself is not because of hygiene issues. That's not what it's related to at all. So how do over-the-counter dandruff medications work? Like dandruff shampoos, like Head and Shoulders. All they really do is when your hair is wet, they're really, really abrasive, so they really like get it all off, right? And then as soon as it dries, it just stays stuck to your head until the next time you wash your hair. Now there are other medications that are prescription medications that work via different mechanisms. But anyway, dandruff isn't particularly about hygiene. Bad hygiene will exacerbate the appearance of dandruff though. Okay, now keratinocytes are held together laterally by desmosomes. And this matters because this means that as they move up, if they were all made as a group, stuck together by desmosomes, when they move up as a group. And not all the desmosomes break. That means that if I scratch my skin is actually not dry for once. If you scratch yourself, you can see like the dryness in your skin. You can actually see it. The reason you can see it is because the cells hold together with desmosomes. You couldn't see an individual cell, but you can see a group of 300 or 400 cells, right? Does that make sense? So the dry skin that you are seeing, and the reason it's visible with the naked eye is because the desmosomes are holding the cells together. What if you damage them all at one time? Like what if I burned my skin, right? Then you would kill all the cells all at one time, right? They would move up really quickly because they were dead and you needed to replace them. And they wouldn't have had time for any of the desmosomes to break. So when they get up to the top, what can you do? You can pull off a big old sheet of them, right? That's because of desmosomes, right? Yeah, that's what sunburn is, right? That's the damage from a sunburn. And you just have to wait a few days, right, for it to come up to the surface. You don't have to wait 30 days because if the tissue is dead, then you're going to regenerate behind it a little more quickly. Does that make sense? So the nature of that peeling with sunburns is the nature of those desmosomes. Okay, all right. So let's get into the first of the 3 types of skin cancer that we're going to discuss in here. Okay, so the 3 types of skin cancer, the very first one that we're going to talk about is a cancer that occurs here. Now, you guys remember that if you have a predisposition to fast cell division anyway, then the tissue is more likely to get cancer? Yes? This is actually the most common of the skin cancers, and it occurs down here in the basal cells, and it's called basal cell carcinoma. So your textbook only has this picture of it, but if something looks like a big old flat booger, you're probably going to know it's bad. So that's late stage. How about early stage, when you probably should take care of it? So let's look at what it looks like in the early stage. Basal cell carcinoma looks like a shiny, usually red, but not always very red, dome in the early stages. Now, as it gets bigger, you're more likely to notice it, but what if it just looked like a little zit that you couldn't pop, right? Just sort of a persistent little zit that you couldn't pop. In the early stages, it generally looks like this. Now, can it kill you? Of course, every cancer can kill you, but this one, of the 3 types of skin cancers that we're going to discuss, is the least likely to metastasize. Do you know what metastasize means? When a cancer moves from one tissue to another, right? So it's the least likely to metastasize. It accounts for the vast majority of skin cancers, but it accounts for very low levels of skin cancer deaths. And if it gets excised and it's not really in the late stages, usually have a full cure with just surgery in about 99% of cases. You don't usually even need chemotherapy or radiation with this one. Okay. Now, of course, it has killed people, yes, but it's least likely to do so of the 3 types of cancer. So that is basal cell carcinoma. Okay. Now, what else is down here besides the basal cells? There's 2 other kinds of cells that you're going to run into. There's one of them. This one is called a tactile cell or a Merkel cell, and this is your most superficial nerve ending. Do you see that it's actually attached to a nerve right here? Do you see that? Okay, so you have absolutely no sensation anywhere above that. Okay, so did anybody do this when they were kids but me? Did anybody stick straight pins into your skin and go torture your siblings with it? Yeah? If you didn't, then you probably had an Xbox and were not a poor kid like me. But no, I played with a towel and I did this and then I like laid out on the roof. So it doesn't hurt. Why doesn't it hurt? Well, because you have absolutely no nerve endings until you get all the way down here. And it doesn't bleed either. Why? It's avascular, exactly, right? You know when you go too deep. You'll feel it, right? So these are your most superficial. Now your dermis has boatloads of nerve endings, but your epidermis only has those one little bit in the deepest layer. Those are called tactile cells or Merkel cells. And then this is where we get into the interesting stuff. Also in this layer, but not exclusively in this layer, are these little guys right here. Do you see this? It looks kind of like Oogie Boogie. Do you guys know who Oogie Boogie is? No? From Nightmare Before Christmas? Doesn't that look like Oogie Boogie? He does, right? These guys right here are called melanocytes. And melanocytes are really important in helping you to understand skin color. They're not exclusively responsible for skin color, but they're partially responsible for skin color. So I want to tell you what melanocytes do, and then we're going to talk about skin color variation, and we're going to talk about albinism and vitiligo. Okay, so here's what your melanocytes do. You got your little Oogie Boogie guys. Woo. Right? Here's your nucleus down here. What melanocytes do is they make a protein pigment that's brown, yellow, brown, or black, and it's called melanin. Yes? And melanin, what they do is they make melanin and they dump it on the side of the cell and then also outside the cell that will get exposed to UV radiation. So as UV comes in from the top, hopefully it will bounce it off, like wearing a dark shirt. Yeah? And it bounces off UV radiation. It's really important because the function of melanin is to protect the nuclei of your cells from mutation, right? And therefore from cancers. Also, the deeper tissue down here, collagen and elastic fibers will break down due to UV exposure. So these are really, really important in protecting your skin and your deeper tissues from damage and from cancers. So I want to talk about the difference in skin colors that exist, what accounts for it, how you can put all this together. So this is a melanocyte. So let's talk about melanocytes and what they actually do. So let's talk about, okay, so skin color variation. This is not even all of the skin colors that exist, right? Just a small subsection. But FYI, there aren't really black versus white people. There's every single color in between, right? And in addition to that, there's also tonal variations because it's not just melanin that is responsible for your skin color. It's also 2 other pigments. The 2 other pigments are keratin. And keratin is a yellowish or greenish pigment that will make your skin have an olive cast to it, right? So if we look around right here, my skin is kind of olive, and I'm also sick today. People with olive skin always look kind of green when they're sick. So I've got olive skin, he's got olive skin, and he's got olive skin. And she's got olive skin. People with olive skin, usually some kind of Mediterranean background, or European, or South American, or my dad is Blackfoot Indian. And they're Asians, basically. Indians are Asians, right? So tonal variation, and depending on how much you have in your skin, you can give it a cast. The other skin tone variation that I can see in her is how much hemoglobin you have to the surface. And hemoglobin, the closer your blood vessels are to the surface, the more of a pink tone your skin gets, right? And so you can see that skin tone variation in these guys. So basically, what skin tone you have is a mix of these three pigments, right? Based on your genetics. Does that make sense? So you see all of these skin tone variations, but I want to talk about what skin tone variations have to do with, especially what the amount of melanin has to do with, because there is some evolution, an evolutionary story there. So let's look at it. The evolutionary story that we see, do you see what skin tones tend to do, right? Where do skin tones tend to be darkest? And this is exclusively looking at melanin. Where? Closest to the equator, right? And that should make pretty good sense to you, right? The equator is where you get the most UV radiation. So let's look at this. This picture is from NASA. This is looking at where UV actually hits the planet most intensely. Do you see? So the most intense UV exposure is right along the equator. So I know that you understand it, but verbalize it for me. Why, historically, evolutionarily speaking, was there selective pressure for darker skin tones? Why? Yeah, to protect from UV radiation, right? But here's the question that a lot of people haven't sort of explored before. Why do you see, now this is just predisposition, we're all mutts, right? And you can have African American people anywhere now, or African people anywhere. So why do skin tones tend to get lighter as you move further away? Why is that? There's also an evolutionary pressure there. Absorb more what? You need to make more vitamin D, and darker skin tones, yes, the UV does not penetrate as well. So if you've got someone in Greenland, right, their skin tone needs to actually let more UV in because there's less UV radiation available. So what you tend to see is as you move further away from the equator, skin tones tend to get lighter. Does that make sense? And that's because of the vitamin D selective pressure that you see right there. Of course, now we're an incredibly mobile population, so everyone is moving everywhere, but we're talking about your historical, right? Your historical predispositions to skin tone variation. Does that make sense? Go ahead.
Will your skin adapt if you were there for long?
No. Your 5 generations from now, children's skin might adapt if you decide to have babies with someone with more skin tone variation. So your skin you've got the genetics that you have. So all you can do is increase survivability and reproductive capacity of the generations in the future, but you have the genetic predisposition that you have. And so you can sort of see why people from the upper portions of North America tend to have lighter skin, South and Central America, darker skin, right? Look at Africa and Asia as you run through the middle, right? So this is just sort of the predisposition. So what is true about people with inherently darker skin? I'm not talking about tanning yet, right? I'm just talking about the color that your skin is baseline with just normal levels of UV exposure. People with darker skin do not have more melanocytes. What they have is more active melanocytes. Their melanocytes, in addition to being more active, they make more melanin. Their melanocytes also, the melanin that they make persists longer. So the melanin that they make will persist, it'll stay around longer, and also it goes more superficial, so it's more protective, right? So more melanin production, more persistent melanin, and more superficial melanin. Now, this gets us to thinking about what can you say a predisposition is for people with inherently darker skin versus inherently lighter skin? Who is less likely to get skin cancer? Darker skin, yes? You are less likely to get skin cancer if you have darker skin. Who ages better? Darker skin, yeah, absolutely, you age better because the UV radiation has a really hard time getting down to your collagen and elastic fibers, right? your collagen and elastic fibers when it's down there. So one of my students from last semester, Mariah's African American, I was talking about this, and she was like, yep, Mel, black don't crack. And it's true. People with dark skin, she can say it, I can't say it. I told her I was going to repeat it, but I had to quote her on it. She's like, you could do it. So people with inherently darker skin, the UV radiation really doesn't get down here, and they don't wrinkle. Their skin doesn't age as much as people with lighter skin. You don't really notice it, the difference between two 20-year-olds, but you will definitely notice the difference between two 40-year-olds and two 60-year-olds. People with darker skin versus lighter skin. So now let's talk about some variations that occur here, and then we'll talk about suntans and sunburns. So there are a couple of disorders of melanin production. One of them is a genetic disorder, and this genetic disorder is called albinism. And albinism, this is a boy of African descent. And albinism, most forms of albinism are autosomal recessive, which means that you would need to have two mutated genes in order for it to occur. And it is a lack of the ability to produce melanin in the skin, the hair, the eyes, or all three. Okay? So all of us have some level of melanin in our skin, our hair, and our eyes. The difference between my eye color, I have hazel or green eyes, and I think you've got blue eyes, right? Okay. So everybody has blue eyes, by the way. There's a blue layer behind all of our eyes as long as we're not albino. Okay? What I have in addition to her is I have another layer that has melanin on the surface. My melanin happens to be kind of yellowish, so it's yellow on top of blue. Green, yeah? And then he has really, really dark eyes. What he has is a really thick layer of melanin on top, right? So have you ever seen somebody with heterochromia and two different color eyes? What happens is generally they're going to have some variation of blue on the back, and either that color on the top was produced or not produced, right? So you can see the variation. So we've all got blue eyes. Some of us have blue eyes plus, okay? So what do you predict about eye color and the likelihood of sun damage? What do you predict? Who is most likely to have sun damage and therefore vision damage as far as eye colors? Yes. Lighter eyes, more likelihood for sun damage and vision loss as you age. He's like, I don't like this story. None of this is working well for me. So now, the problem when you really get it is when you have pretty much no melanin in your eyes. So this little boy still has some melanin production in his eyes. This child does not. When you have no melanin production in your eyes, then you are only going to see the capillary flow, and that's what you're seeing there. So you can see only capillaries. This is a person with albinism of the skin, hair, and eyes. This person has an increased risk of cancers of the skin, will age poorly, and people with albinism of the eyes generally lose their vision as they age. One of my students in the last class told me, and I hadn't heard this before, she said her cousin has albinism, and she is going to blind training, even though she still has her vision, because eventually she is going to lose her vision, and they plan for that their whole lives. So, and there are some lenses that you can put in, but the lenses are not as protective as your own melanin. It doesn't actually allow UV to bounce off as readily. So this is genetic, and like I mentioned, most of it is autosomal recessive, most forms of albinism. So can anybody tell me why the likelihood of albinism increases really dramatically in inbred populations?
Because you're going to be seeing the same genes expressed over and over.
Yeah, and so if I, for instance, married my first cousin and had children with my first cousin, it's more likely that I will have the same mutations as my first cousin than if I married somebody from outside of my population group, right? So my dad's Native American, my husband's Dutch. I'm pretty sure we don't have the same mutations, right? But if you marry your first cousin, if you're up in Appalachia and you're isolated, and you're gonna have sex with somebody, right? It's just like inevitable that you're gonna, right? And you might not have even known they were your first cousin. Or the history of the European royal families. Why was there so much inbreeding in the European royal families? because they were trying to keep their royal blood pure, right? And so in order to do that, you might have to marry your first cousin, right? 17 times over. If you're Cleopatra, if you go back that far, she married her brother, who was also 15 or 20 years younger than her. It's just some weird, I don't know. I shouldn't be judging, but she's dead, so I can do it, right? It's fine. Okay, so Meghan Markle marrying into the royal family with some nice variability, right? It's good for the royal family, very good for it. Okay, so that's albinism. It increases in likelihood with what we call consanguinity, and consanguinity means if you're more genetically similar, you're more likely to have any autosomal recessive disorder, but this one is not uncommon. And then let's introduce you to the concept of vitiligo. Vitiligo is not genetic. It is an autoimmune disorder, and vitiligo is a patchy loss of pigmentation because for some reason your immune system just starts to destroy melanocytes, but it's regional. So this little girl right here is of African descent, and you can see that she has this patchy loss of pigmentation here. Now, wherever you have the patchy loss of pigmentation, you also have loss of protection from UV radiation. Now, there's no cure for any autoimmune disorders. All autoimmune disorders are more likely in women than they are in men. And what happens is it can go into remission. And then the melanocytes will regenerate and you'll start making melanin again. And then it'll come back. It'll go into remission and come back. This is what Michael Jackson said made his skin light. Is not how it works, Michael. However, it may have been the initial thing that made him choose to bleach his skin afterward, which you can do. You can have bleaching procedures. Here are the hands of two people with vitiligo. This person had inherently dark skin. This person had lighter skin. And obviously it's more noticeable in people with dark skin because there's more contrast, right? Does that make sense? Now, this is vitiligo, and this is a really famous model who got really popular the last 2 years with vitiligo, just to show you that it does not have to be unattractive. Notice how beautifully symmetrical it is, mostly symmetrical on her. For some reason, most autoimmune disorders, and we do not know why, most autoimmune disorders, whether it's MS or lupus, they mostly hit symmetrically. It's a freaking mystery. This one included. Look at like her eyes, this portion right here of her eyes, and almost symmetrical on her face, almost symmetrical on her hands. Her name is Winnie something, I don't remember. Winnie something. So that's vitiligo as well. I think that's really cool. Okay, so what is a suntan and what is a sunburn related to this story? So, and this is important for you guys to understand. So what a suntan is if you hit your melanocytes with UV radiation, they will try to increase their melanin production to protect you. That's what a suntan is, right? So what it is a suntan is basically making your melanocytes cry melanin, right? They're like, stop it, stop it, stop it, and they make more melanin, right? And then the melanin will stay around for however long it stays around, which is genetically predisposed. So some people have more persistent melanin and less persistent melanin, so it'll stay around. But it means, without a doubt, that UV radiation did hit your melanocytes, okay? Now, what happens if you overwhelm the capacity of your melanocytes to protect you? You get a sunburn. And a sunburn is evidence that you have done damage with UV radiation to cells that are as deep or perhaps deeper than your melanocytes. And sunburns are a big, big deal, much bigger deal than we gave them credit for when I was a kid. When I was a kid, first of all, ain't nobody wore sunscreen at all, right? And second, we did brilliant things, like I would get up on the roof with baby oil and iodine and lay on my apartment roof, which is probably where all these wrinkles came from, lay on my apartment roof with no sunscreen whatsoever. And I didn't realize what I was doing. Now we are a little smarter, at least theoretically, because we know now that if you have, last time I looked up the stat was last year, if you have 2 or more blistering sunburns in your life, It increases your lifetime risk of all 3 sorts of skin cancer by 250%. So it is telling you that you absolutely got UV damage. Okay, so we're going to talk about melanoma as well. So a sunburn basically is skin damage due to UV radiation exposure. Now, in what way, even if they both blister, in what way is like a steam burn or a burn from a fire safer than a sunburn? No UV radiation. They both can potentially be as painful. They're just as likely to cause scarring, but one of them has the added damage of UV radiation, which is a known mutagen and therefore a known carcinogen. Okay? This is really important for those of us who are parents to understand, because it is even worse when you allow it to happen in children because their cells have a faster rate of mitosis. Now, they don't usually get cancer as a child. What happens is eventually it will show up, but it can show up 20, 25 years later. Go ahead.
So is it safe to, like, say you go outside every day?
Oh, yeah.
That's
Yeah.
safe, as long as you're not using it.
You need to get a little bit of sun to make vitamin D, but it's within minutes per day, not hours per day. We need a little bit, but if you're getting to the point that you are having skin color changes regularly, that means your melanocytes are trying to protect you. And if you are burning, then that's a problem, of course, right? And it's going to get to be more of a problem as we have more environmental degradation and more loss of ozone and those kinds of things. So we have less protection, so we need to protect ourselves more. Okay, so a lot of times, people who are trying to sell you tanning memberships like to tell you that tanning beds are far, far safer than the UV radiation from the sun. I will tell you that tanning beds increase the risk of all 3 types of skin cancer. They have a reduced increase in one of the 3 types. The other 2 are exactly the same. But it doesn't really matter because they're all deadly, potentially deadly, right? And tanning beds will, of course, cause all of the aging problems. So even if you are not particularly worried about cancer, ugly happens to all of us. Yes? Put it off as long as possible, right? You don't want to be ugly early. You want to be ugly later when everyone's ugly and you're equally ugly in the same ugly nursing home, right? It's fine. So we will talk about dramatically what happens with UV radiation and skin aging. It's really, really dramatic. I wish I could go back and redo some of those decisions. So let's talk about moles, and then we're going to talk about melanoma, which is the worst of the 3 types of skin cancer because it's the most likely to kill you. So all a pigmented mole is, like this one right here, it's just I inherited or developed a whole bunch of melanocytes in one area, right? Okay, now, why are moles more likely to be the location of melanoma? Well, just because statistically there's more melanocytes there, right? So do moles cause melanoma? Does every melanoma start with a mole? No. But if I have this one, and every time I go to the doctor, they ask me whether this has changed. It's been the same since I was 7, from what I remember. It's how I learned my lefts and rights. I didn't know everybody didn't have these. I thought this was really helpful. But it hasn't changed. So a pigmented mole is just an overgrowth of melanocytes in one area. You have to watch them just because there's so many melanocytes there. And now I want to talk about the worst of the types of skin cancer. And it's only worse because even though it's not the most common, it metastasizes really, really quickly compared to the other 2. It moves from the skin usually to the lungs, the liver, and the brain. And it metastasizes pretty damn fast, and it's called melanoma. And melanoma is nothing to mess around with. So these are all melanomas, okay? So melanomas, what they do is they start with melanocytes, and you have uncontrolled cell division of melanocytes. And melanomas only account for 5% of skin cancers, but they account for the vast majority of skin cancer deaths, because if you don't catch it early, it's already in some other tissue. It moves really, really quickly. I would like for you to understand that there is a genetic predisposition to all of the types of skin cancer. So if you know someone in your family with melanoma, pay more attention to your skin, not less attention to your skin. So How do you tell a melanoma? Well, first of all, you don't try to diagnose yourself, and you sure as hell don't ask me to diagnose you, right? Because I deal with dead people. I'm like, I've never killed a one because they were already dead when I got them. So don't ask me. Go home and do a mold check with someone who is a willing, enthusiastic participant, and maybe it'll turn into something more fun. Here is what you are looking for with a melanoma: enthusiasm, right? That's not what you're looking for with melanoma. You are looking for the signs of melanoma recognition. First of all, the ugly duckling sign, is it really weird looking and you're embarrassed about it? You might want to get it checked. But then there are the better ones, which are melanomas tend to be asymmetrical in shape. One side is different than the other. They tend to have B, border irregularity. So we'll look back at these in just a second when you see this. C, the color varies within the mole, right? D, diameter. As it gets bigger, it's a bigger concern, right? Does that make sense? E, it changes over time. Those are the warning signs. And now let's look at this again. Do you see asymmetry in these? Do you see border irregularity? Color variation? Yeah? You can't tell the sizes because you need something for scale, but most of these are relatively large. And these are melanomas, and these are not good signs. So let's talk about where you need to look for any kinds of skin cancer, right? Now, skin cancer, like every cancer, can occur just wherever the hell it chooses. But all forms of skin cancer are more likely in areas that have lots of exposure to UV radiation, right? Because UV radiation is a mutagen, a carcinogen, right? So you have to be there, but it's more likely to be there. So now let's talk about men versus women. The location that typically, not for every person, but just typically, men get cancer is different than the locations that women get cancer. Where do you think men are most likely to get cancer? Skin cancer, sorry. Yeah, ears, back of neck, face, hands, right? Why? Why those locations? UV exposure, short hair, typically speaking, right? Not all men have short hair, right? Okay, now why are men more likely to get cancer on their face than women typically?
You got like the lotion,
How much money do I spend on freaking lotion to try to keep my face from like getting UV exposure? A ton. Let's just do a little poll. There's only 4 dudes in here. Which of you 4 wears sunscreen? 5 dudes. Which of you 5 wears sunscreen? 2. Okay. Now, typically speaking, men do not wear makeup. There are exceptions. They also are less likely to wear sunscreen, and so they're more likely to get cancers on their skin. A lot of times on their noses, it'll pop up. Now, women do get skin cancer, but they usually get it in different places just because we have different predispositions, right? They're less likely to get it on their face because we're more likely to wear makeup and all kinds of protection. Because even though we're not particularly concerned about cancer most of the time, we're always concerned about ugly, aren't we? We're always concerned about ugly, right? So lots and lots of stuff. So they're less likely to get it on your face. We're less likely to get it on the back of our necks because their hair is more likely to be longer. Backs of our ears, not as much of a problem. Oh, by the way, dudes get it on their head as they start going bald too. But the locations that women tend to get it are, please listen, all you beautiful young women who still have not damaged this part right here. Because I put it right here, not right here. Put some sunscreen right here because it's going to get ugly, okay? Put some sunscreen on your hands too. That's where women also get it. So women tend to get it on their chest, on their hands. Depending on the culture, they might get it on their shoulders. Because women are more likely to wear strapless or spaghetti strap or tank tops, right? Not so much here in this culture. My mother-in-law practically has a conniption fit every single time I wear a tank top, right? And I'm like, I have not bought into your stuff, dude. They're just shoulders. It's not point shoulders. It's just shoulders. That's all it is, right? She gets all freaked out and she has to have a shoulder conversation with me. I'm like, it's a shoulder. But on the shoulders. And then the other place that women get it is the backs of their legs. Now, again, that's culturally specific because in some cultures you're more likely to wear short stuff than in other cultures. But in addition, we don't like to look back there after a certain age, do we? You're like, I'm just going to assume that everything is fine. I haven't looked back there in a decade. Let's just pretend it looks good. No, you got a weird looking mole back there that somebody needs to pay some attention to. So those are the locations that women are more likely to get all of the sorts of skin cancer. So you can check for them. And when I go to the doctor, since I'm already in a freaking paper gown, right? Maybe I got my feet up on the stirrups. I ask them to check everything. I'm like, look at every little dot that you could possibly find. Now, melanoma is really, really serious. I've got 2 friends that have melanoma stories. It is most likely to be in locations that get sun exposure, but please don't just count on that. One of my friends, she's fine now. So I'm not laughing because she's dead. She's fine. She did get melanoma, and she got melanoma on her labia minora. WTF is all I have to say. I tanned with her, and she did not tan that way. So she got it. She did. And then she had to have them cut off and then reconstructive surgery. She's fine. So she got them on her labia minora. The other friend, I knew her when she was in her 40s, and she had melanoma when she was in her 20s, and it was right here, like on her clavicle. And she's from Texas, like I'm from Texas. She was going to school up in Washington, and she would come home, and her mom would do what your mom would do, right? Which is go to the doctor, you need to get that checked. And she did what you would do, which is, wah, 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 wah. Well, the 3rd time she came home, her mom didn't even ask her, just took her straight from the airport to the dermatologist, right? Because that's a mama for you right there. And she never left. So they checked her into the hospital that day. The melanoma that she had was about half the size of my pinky, right? And this is how much tissue they took. They took her skin from the bottom of her chin all the way out, and then down to about the middle, almost the bottom of her sternum. She had skin grafts from her butt, and she also had chemotherapy and radiation, and with all of that, they gave her 2 years to live in all probability. But she did live. It had already metastasized, but the chemo worked. It had already metastasized, I think, to her lungs, but the chemo worked and she recovered from it. So it's a really, really serious cancer when it occurs. You got to be really, really careful with it. Okay, so that's melanoma. So the next layer that we'll do it next time because you guys are a couple minutes ahead. We'll start with the stratum spinosum, and then that's the last cancer that we will talk about will be there. So you don't have a quiz when I see you on Monday. You will probably have one the next Wednesday. Yeah? Okay.